غرباء 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 ولغير الله لا نحمل جباه غرباء.
الحمد لله والصلاة والسلام على رسول الله وعلى آله من استنى بسنته ودعا بدعوته إلى يوم الدين. أما بعد, this is our third lesson in this series where we are studying al-Manzumah al-Bayqūniyyah, and in today's lesson we will be studying from the 9th line in the poem, where we will be discussing al-Hadith al-Muttasil and al-Hadith al-Musalsal, al-Hadith al-Aziz, and al-Hadith al-Mashhur, and possibly we will cover al-Hadith al-Mu'an'an and al-Hadith al-Mubham. Al-Hadith al-Muttasil, in the last lesson we discussed al-Hadith al-Musnad, and we said that al-Hadith al-Musnad, it's one that is at least connected on the surface, so it doesn't have anything that gives it up, like say if there was something like balaghani, it has reached to me, or hadithtu an, I have been told that something happened involving so and so narrator. So if any of this is found in the hadith, we would say the hadith is munqati' right away. But if it at least appears to contain an fulan and fulan and fulan, and they all are actually students of each other, then this chain will be said to be musnad on the surface at least. And if we investigate it further and it appears to be actually the case that every narrator in it has truly heard the hadith in question from the teacher he's professing to have studied it from, then the hadith will remain musnad, and it would then rise to the level of al-muttasil, however. And so the poet, he says here, وَمَا بِسَمْعِ كُلِّ رَاوٍ يَتَّصِلْ إِسْنَادُهُ لِلْمُصْطَفَى فَالْمُتَّصِلْ. And any hadith that is connected through the hearing of every narrator from the subsequent narrator. So every narrator in the chain hears the hadith directly, he studies the hadith directly from the subsequent narrator, from his teacher, as far as the hadith is concerned, that is Lil Mustafa, up to getting to the level of the Prophet ﷺ. This hadith is called al-Muttasil. وَمَا بِسَمْعِ كُلِّ رَاوٍ يَتَّصِلْ إِسْنَادُهُ لِلْمُصْطَفَى فَالْمُتَّصِلْ. And any hadith that is connected through the hearing of every narrator, every hadith, the chain of which is connected through the hearing of every narrator from the subsequent narrator up to the Prophet ﷺ, then such a hadith is called al-Hadith al-Muttasil. And to give an example, we would simply say pick Sahih Bukhari, and any hadith you pick at random, it will be Muttasil. Pick Sahih Bukhari or Muslim, any random hadith you would pick would be Muttasil. Then he goes on to describe al-Hadith al-Musalsal, and he says, Musalsalun qul ma ala wasfin ata mithlu ama wallahi ambani al-fata kadhaka qad haddathanihi qa'ima aw ba'da an haddathani tabassama. From the beginning, he defined al-Hadith أولها الصحيح وهو ما اتصل إسناده بنقل وهو ما اتصل إسناده يرويه عدل ضابط عن مثله معتمد في ضبطه ونقله. I'm trying to count the number of lines he discussed al-Hadith Sahih in 2 lines. Okay, al-Hadith Sahih, every other category he's defining only 1 line. And we come to al-Hadith al-Musalsal as well, and he's defining it in 2 lines. Musalsalun qul ma ala wasfin ata mithlu ama wallahi ambani al-fata kadhaka qad haddathanihi qa'ima aw ba'da an haddathani tabassama. He says al-Hadith al-Musalsal is qul, say, musalsalun qul. If you want hadith musalsal, here it is. If you want to define it, say ma ala wasfin ata. It's any hadith that is narrated with the recurrence of a specific feature, a particular feature. Mithlu ama wallahi ambani al-fata. An example would be if every narrator in the chain were to say, wallahi, my teacher has told me. Mithlu ama wallahi ambani al-fata. So So if, see, the teacher, while he was coming to teach his student, he said, Wallahi, my teacher told me this. And so the teacher goes to the student, the teacher tells his student, Wallahi, my teacher taught me this hadith. And the student goes to teach his students, and he also says, Wallahi, my teacher told me this hadith, and he said, Wallahi. And the student also goes to tell his student, who also says, Wallahi, my teacher told me this. So such a hadith, we would say it is musalsal, okay, and it is tasalsul ala wasfin, and the wasf is that every teacher in it says, my teacher has told me, and he swears by Allah. كذاك قد حدثنيه قائما, or he taught me this hadith standing. He taught me this hadith standing. أو بعد أن حدثني تبسم, or he smiled after he taught me this hadith. Okay, an example is found in Sahih Muslim, hadith number 728. Hadith of al-Mu'minin, Habiba, one of the Prophet's wife, Habiba, radiyallahu ta'ala anha, she said, سمعت رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم يقول, I heard the Prophet صلى الله عليه وسلم saying, من صلى 12 ركعة في يوم وليلة بني له بهن بيت في الجنة. So that I heard the Prophet صلى الله عليه وسلم say, whoever prays 12 raka'at in a day, a house, a home will be built for him in Jannah. A home will be built for him in Jannah. Now, Habiba, when she taught this hadith to her student, she said, فَمَا تَرَكْتُهُنَّ مُنْذُ سَمِعْتُهُنَّ مِنْ رَسُولِ اللَّهِ صَلَّى اللَّهِ عَلَيْهِ وسلم. Since I heard the Prophet ﷺ say this, these 12 raka'at, I've never abandoned them. I always did them every day. And her student was Ambasa. And Ambasa, when he also told his student, al-Nu'man bin Salim, he said to him, فَمَا تَرَكْتُهُنَّ مُنْذُ سَمِعْتُهُنَّ مِنْ أُمِّ حَبِيبَةٍ. Since I heard my teacher, Habiba, mention the virtues there are in praying 12 raka'at every day, I have never left this raka'at. 12 raka'at every day, nawafil. 2 before Zuhur, 2 after Zuhur, raka'atay al-Fajr, 2 after Isha, and Shaf' and Witr. Al-Nu'man bin Salim, when his teacher Ambasa taught him, Al-Nu'man bin Salim also said, مَا تَرَكْتُهُنَّ مُنْذُ سَمِعْتُهُنَّ مِنْ So Ambasa told his student, who was Amr bin Aus. Amr bin Aus, that's the student of Ambasa. And Amr bin Aus, he also said to his student, Al-Nu'man bin Salim, okay, مَا تَرَكْتُهُنَّ مُنْذُ سَمِعْتُهُنَّ مِنْ Ambasa. And Al-Nu'man bin Salim, he also said, مَا تَرَكْتُهُنَّ مُنْذُ سَمِعْتُهُنَّ مِنْ Amr bin Aus. So first, it was Habiba who heard it from the Prophet ﷺ. And she said to her student Ambasa, that I've never, a day has not passed me by that I've not done these 12 raka'ats. And Ambasa, he told his student Amr bin Aus, not a single day has passed me since I heard this hadith from Habiba that I have not done 12 raka'ats in a day of nawafil. And Amr bin Aus, he also said to his student Salim, Al-Nu'man bin Salim, that not a day has passed me that I've not prayed 12 raka'at of nawafil since hearing this hadith from Ambasa. And Al-Nu'man bin Salim, he also said to his students, not a day has passed me by that I have not prayed 12 raka'at of nawafil since I heard this hadith from my teacher Amr bin Aus. And so we say this statement is musalsal, it's recurring in the narration. Or you pick a hadith where every narrator in it says haddathana, 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 haddathana. So we say this hadith is musalsalun bit tahdith. Every narrator says haddathana. Or sami'tu, sami'tu, sami'tu. Okay, in fact, hadith number 1 in Sahih Bukhari, innama al-a'malu bin-niyyat. Okay, it's musalsalun bi sami'tu. Okay, and when you get to the last part, just before it connects to Umar, that I heard my teacher saying on the mimbar, and his teacher said I heard my teacher saying on the mimbar, and I heard Umar saying on the mimbar. So this is also musalsal. This is also musalsal. Another example is, and this is popular, and I'm only mentioning it because of the popularity, hadith of Abu Huraira, where he says, أخذ رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم بيدي فقال خلق الله عز وجل. The Prophet ﷺ took my hand and he said, Allah created the heavens and the earth. in 6 days to the end of the hadith. As-Suyuti in his book Jiyalul Musalsala, he said this hadith is musalsalun bi tashbiki kulli rawin bi yadi tilmizihi mithla ma fa'ala Rasulullah bi Abi Hurairah. When the Prophet was teaching Abu Hurairah this hadith, he held his hand and he told him. When Abu Hurairah came to teach his student, he also held his hand. And when his student came to teach, he also held his hand. And so we say this hadith is musalsalun bi tashbik. So he held his hand this way and he taught him the hadith. Okay, so this is al-hadith al-musalsal. Al-hadith al-musalsal. The next one is al-hadith al-aziz. Al-hadith al-aziz. Now al-hadith al-aziz, we are studying it only because it's mentioned in the book. But the reality is, there's no such division as al-hadith al-aziz. Yes, you will find it in books and so on and so forth. But then, you go beyond, let's say, you go beyond Ibn Salah and Al-Khatib al-Baghdadi, you find no use of al-aziz. You don't find the scholars like Imam al-Hanbal, Imam al-Bukhari, Imam Muslim, Imam al-Tirmizi even, and Imam Muslim, you don't find them using anything like al-hadith al-aziz. So al-hadith al-aziz in reality doesn't actually exist, where we describe a hadith with 2 recurring narrators at every level as being al-aziz. There's no such in the discussions of hadith scholars, you don't find it. Okay, but then in books of mustalah you will find it, and so we will discuss it as the scholars of mustalah they have discussed, not that you will find any existence of it when you advance into hadith science. And for most people this would be strange, and so but if anyone argues, you simply say bring a usage before these people that we have, these scholars that we have identified. You wouldn't find it. Anyway, he says Aziz marwi ithnaini aw thalatha mashhur marwi fawqa ma thalatha. He says al-hadith al-aziz is one that is recorded by at least 2 narrators, aw thalatha, or 3. So at every level in the chain, there are at least 2 narrators or 3 narrators. If it comes down to 1, it will become al-hadith al-gharib, which we will look at later. At least there should be 1 narrator, 2 narrators at every level. So at the level of, say, the teachers of Imam al-Bukhari, there should be 2 teachers. So for example, Abdullah bin Yusuf and Abdullah bin Maslamat al-Qa'nabi, 2 of them, they collaborated in teaching Bukhari this hadith. And on the level above them, say Imam Malik and Sufyan bin Uyayna teach them both. And on the level above, say Az-Zuhri and Salim, okay, say Az-Zuhri and Nafi', they both teach the level of Imam Malik. And then it goes up, say Ibn Umar and Anas bin Malik, they both teach the level of Nafi' and whoever, the level of Nafi' and Salim, for example. So this hadith would be aziz, because there are at least 2 narrators at every level, or 3. There should be 3 or 2. If it comes down to 1, then it will not be al-hadith al-aziz. Okay, so he says Aziz Umar with Naini aw thalatha. Al-hadith al-aziz is one that's narrated by at least 2 narrators at every level of the chain, or 3. Mashhur Umar with fawqa ma thalatha. And al-hadith al-mashhur is one that is recorded by more than 3 on every level. But then what is most common in the books of mustalah is that we require at least 2 narrators on every level to have al-hadith al-aziz. At least 3 on every level, then we have al-hadith al-mashhur, not more than 3. Obviously, more than 3, that's even welcome. But if it comes below to 3, that's mashhur. If it comes below to 2, okay, it comes below 3 to 2, that is al-aziz. And if it comes below 2 to 1, it becomes al-hadith al-gharib. But it is important to note here that the number of narrators on every level, they might add to the authenticity of hadith, but they don't reduce the strength of it. If a hadith is authentic, it doesn't matter how many narrators are narrating at every level. But then the more narrators that are narrating it, the better it is for it. In fact, one interesting thing is, the more that there are narrators narrating a hadith at every level, the harder the job of a muhaddis becomes to investigate it further, and the more likely it is going to have problems. However, if it has just 1 or 2 narrators, okay, narrating it from every level, and they are both of the finest caliber of narrator, then the safer the hadith becomes. Okay, I'm going to say it again, and maybe I will elaborate a little bit more because this is important. If we have just one narrator at every level who is of the finest caliber of narrator, then the safer the hadith is. There are just two narrators and they are of the finest caliber on every level, the safest the hadith can be. But the more that we are having narrators on every level, the more trouble the hadith is likely to get in. The reason is this: you have a court case, just bringing this example so that perhaps we can understand better. So you have a court case and you have 2-3 witnesses. It's easier to collaborate your stories than if there are 10 or 100 witnesses. Your story might be true, but 100 witnesses, that will be very difficult to collaborate, to corroborate your story. And so the more witnesses you have, which should have been easy, in fact, actually the more harder it might become for you to prove your case, because when your witnesses are cross-examined, it is very easy to get them not to corroborate the story. And so the more witnesses, the more trouble you could be getting in, although it would seem you should be safer with more witnesses. Now, it's the same thing in hadith. So hadith science is more or less like students saying, we have all witnessed our teacher doing this or saying this. And so if it's just one narrator or two narrators of the finest caliber and their story agree, then you say the hadith becomes very, very safe. But then if there are many narrators and they are all saying we heard our teacher, then there is a high chance that there is going to be discrepancies, and so some of them would have to be ruled out because they would become shadh or mu'all or munkar and so on and so forth. And so I would go on and say this again, and this is a fa'idah. Yurhalu ilayha. Most people think that when a hadith has several chains, it will become authentic. I mean, from this example that I just gave, it's not the case. And we do not get a chains of a hadith to authenticate it. Rather, we get a chains of hadith to investigate it. So, chain gathering, jam'u turuq, ليس المقصود منه التقوية والاعتبار وإنما المقصود منه تبيين الوجه الصواب في رواية الحديث. هذا هو المقصود من جمع الطرق. The chains of hadith are not collected in numbers to authenticate and to strengthen a hadith. Rather, chains are collected to compare and detect and determine which narration is best. Okay, which narration is most accurate and is most correct. And this is a misconception that most people have, that if we have several chains for a hadith, then we can authenticate it. We are working within some time frames. I would have actually gone on to give you examples where we have a chain with two hadiths being safe, and then the moment the chains begin to come in and in, the hadith got into some trouble. The next hadith, the next division we have is al-hadith al-mu'an'an. Al-hadith al-mu'an'an. He says, mu'an'anun ka'an sa'idin an karam wa mubhamu ma fihi rawin lam yusam. On a second thought, I think we will adjourn this discussion into our next lesson, where we'll be able to have the time to discuss it in some more details rather than rush it through, because we just dropped some points on al-hadith al-aziz there. Subhanakallah wa bihamdika, ashhadu an la ilaha illa anta astaghfiruka wa atubu ilayk.